You are watching
There are
Xirtus.
magical stones according to many religions. In fact, the Deuteronomists and the Sadducee would wear these rabbinical chest plates like Darth Vader that have a stone representing every tribe of Israel. So each one of them might be in contact with some sort of seer's stone. Again, like the Mormons have this idea of a seer's stone or a magic stone. The Vikings also use this idea of magic stones, and the Kaaba, again, with the Muslims, this idea that there's a piece of this temple, which is the first stone fashioned by God with Adam, that the entire universe is entangled to. So these quantum entanglements could lead to connection between our reality and different realities that are in the hands of higher ascended angelic beings or demonic beings, right? That's basically what Solomon's doing when he's building the temple. He's using the cornerstone in order to trap demons, that he, according to the Bible, he's trapping demons in order to make them do the magic of building the temple. And all of these stories come around this idea of using the magic of these supernatural beings by trapping them and forcing them to commit whatever sort of supernatural constructions or energy flows that anyone would want. But there's more to it, because the idea of angels ascending and descending means that you're opening up between realities. So realities that are, this is my reality, this is your reality, or this is, the prime timeline, this is another timeline, that these could be ascended, descended between sixth dimensional or seventh dimensional beings, which would be the higher choir of seraphim angels that are able to see exactly what would happen if you were to make this choice or you were to make that choice, what the differences would be. And with that information, they can guide you, because they can't make physical changes to this reality, but they can communicate with you by vibration, sound waves that can affect your particles. And you can make choices based on them saying, if you go left, this is where you'll end up. If you go right, this is where you'll end up. So using their kind of understanding of space-time and the future in order to make perfect choices, right? Or the choices that benefit you. Of course, why would a super being do that? A lot of the time, the idea, even from the ancients, is these are demons that would trick you if they could. So the trapping is in order that you'll release them. There's usually a chronicler who's outside of the mage circle. So they're watching this whole thing happen in case the mage is somehow manipulated by the demon who's in the Solomon seal triangle that's designed to trap this demon. But these are the ideas of the ancients, that they would use these magic rocks in order to take command of our reality to some extent.
Yeah. And I would say, it obviously then relates into, this Jacob's ladder thing, them trying to either figure out a way to ascend out of the abyss into the earthly realm, or they want to get higher. They want to get back to being let back into God's, you know, forgiveness and love and heaven. But, I think it does take probably a very complex understanding of all the different elements maybe needed into this ultimate stone kind of thing, like Marvel shows and everything, maybe a melding of them all, right? So there could be many stones. The one in Lapis Exillis is the name of the documentary. That was a stone that he believes was found, I believe, like in the 1600s in the United States, and then it was sent back to either England or France, and then it got pirated, and then recaptured, and then got sent back to the Rosicrucians. Sent it back to America. So the group that found it were actually Canadian fur trappers called the
Right.
Levandri, and they were coming down one of the river systems and stuff like that, doing their fur trapping, and they got into Colorado, and there was two pillars that they found, or it was at least in the Rockies. It might not have been Colorado, as far
But
down as
they
Colorado.
came through Ontario for sure. Right. And there's
Yeah.
a whole thing on this because the British were saying that they were afraid of other nations getting it from the 17th century on into the Nazis, right? They were worried about the Scone. There's like a great quote that I've got from the Office of Works talking about how they need to keep the stone in the North Americas and keep it in Canada says, I trust the Office of Works will not lend itself to this attempt by the Scotch to get a hold of the Scone Stone by a side wind. You cannot be so simple as to not know that this acquisitive nation has ever since the time of Edward I been attempting by fair means or foul to get possession of the stone. And during my time at Westminster, we have received warnings from the police that Scottish emissaries. Now, what Scottish rightly would be called emissaries, right? These are Scottish Rite Freemasons. Scottish emissaries were loose in London intending to steal the stone, and we had better lock up the confessor's chapel where it was normally kept. This is interesting from the perspective of what was happening with the Freemasons and the Rosicrucian Jesuits, because the Jesuits clearly ended up in a huge position of power after World War II. They made deals with the CIA. The Vatican had made deals with the Reich and then eventually with the CIA, and had completely manipulated for the power of the archdiocese to control most regions. The New York archdiocese controlling major parts of the East Coast, the West Coast archdiocese controlling major pieces of the West Coast, governors and senators underneath, like Freemasonic governors and senators underneath the Jesuit Rosicrucian control. So the Rosicrucians don't get looked at as interesting, I mean, as seriously as I think it'd be worth looking at for their influence on the world stage, because they always kind of come off as kind of insular and quiet, but nothing can be further from the truth when you really see how many important people, particularly now in technology in Silicon Valley, are Rosicrucians, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I would say that the possibility of the stone maybe or maybe not being the original scone stone, it just matters depending on what we can find in the information that has mostly been destroyed by the Romans and stuff of the north. But from the evidence that they were showing is that this was Vikings that had come over, you know, however many years in the 1300s or prior to that, and they had brought in this specific stone over, and so it seems to have the same kind of ability as Jacob's Pillow Stone, but like you were saying, there's probably, multiple of these stones. Once they figured out like what it looks like and maybe some of the geology behind it, they knew how to maybe possibly find others. And it's kind of like the dark crystal, chunks have been broken off of the main crystal, and maybe they're trying to gather them to bring it back together. That's all kind of up in the air,
There's
who
definitely
knows?
a number. So there's like in 1950, there's the story that the Scone Stone was split in half. These are
Yeah.
all things you can like check on Wiki. These are like open stories, and most of the pictures you'll see, they'll tell you these are replicas of the stone. They don't publicly display the stone in any
Yeah.
way that you have access to. So it being moved around, and especially talking about like the 13th century on, I think it's the Walter of Guisborough or something like that is the one who writes about the monastery of Scone, saying that this is essentially ancient Jerusalem, which is really an interesting idea that these, at least these people, believe that Jerusalem was actually in Scotland, that Scotland was at some point this
New
holy,
Jerusalem.
yeah, right.
Yeah. And we're the new Atlantis, right? So I think they use those kind of as different ways of explaining where they think this spot is or where it moves. Like they're following geomancy, they're following very specific things that they see in geology, because geology kind of forms in a similar way as even humans and bodies and stuff on this earth do in clouds. Why is it that we see things in the clouds? Why do they take these certain forms? Because I believe the energy that they're in is causing them to form in those ways, right? The energy kind of dictates how the body of the thing looks. And so they knew that about all the different dynamics. That's some of the insight that they had been cataloging for a long time. And so they're following geographical and all other kinds of signs, different birds and lightning strikes and all this stuff to kind of move this thing to where it needs to go. And I think they do have a backstory that they don't share with us, that they're looking for a very specific place. And I've said this, on Xirtus' show quite a few times. I think that they were always trying to find the Americas. They were looking for it for a very specific reason. They always kind of knew it was there. It was there. People that were doing maps and all kinds of stuff that were in the know knew about it way before they said that they knew about it. They kept a lot of those things secret. That's why we're finding all kinds of weird treasures that were left, that seem to date way farther back than the discovery of America and stuff like that, buried in, what was it, the money pit in Nova Scotia or whatever, right?
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
you know the deal with Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, right, Jordan? Have you read that, or do you know what we're talking about?
A little bit. I haven't read it, but
yeah. So just a real quick backup, and like we have a video. I have a video on it. You can watch Sir Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. He wrote a treaty for a book, and he hid it inside of another book that was just on herbology, which is really an interesting place to hide this. Talking about in the Western world, like if you sail west, eventually you come to a turtle island, which is Canada. And this is written before that was common, and saying that on the lands there had already been Israelites who had arrived. And this is interesting because that's the Mormon story, but it's something that Sir Francis Bacon is writing about, that Israelites came to the Americas and they lived there in harmony. And a big part of the story is that a King James Bible washes up on shore. I think this is a poetic metaphor he's using, but that they find the book, and very much like Tim Allen's Galaxy Quest, that they model their society off the Star Trek show they watched.
right.
This group of native indigenous Israelites modeled their lives off of this King James Bible. They're thinking this is the way to live, and they make a more perfect Christian society than any that's been achieved in Europe, right? Or Eurasia. So that's already the reason for so many Rosicrucians coming to the Americas, saying, okay, well, we have to build New Atlantis. And that's the title of it, New Atlantis, Nova Atlantis. So there's already work in Canada for this purpose. And if you follow from Ontario into Minnesota and the Michigan and the lakes, there's all of these areas where, for instance, in Alexandria in Minnesota, there's the Kensington Rune Stone, which is a giant kind of Rosetta Stone that's written in a Viking script, probably from the 13th century. And numbers of examples like this of groups of hermeneutic Gnostics that believed in some sort of a different Christianity than one that we're really familiar with today.